He had been asked to remove an email that was sent mistakenly. It was supposed to go to Janice, and it went to Joni instead. And being that they both had J names, it was a mistake.
By
Marcus.
By Marcus.
Marcus, yes.
So
Marcus.
he mistakenly sent an email to his wife that was meant for his mistress.
Correct.
Big oops.
Yes.
What's, I think, stunning about this is that I guess I've always, just from what I've heard so far, I've assumed that Janice was single because she was single when she was in Texas.
Yes, I thought she was single because when I met her, she was single.
But we're talking, this predates that. This is back when she was in Colorado, and this happened when she was still married. So that makes what happened with Marcus even worse because he split up a family.
It's horrible to think about that. It's so disheartening. We all looked up to him so much and just thought that he was such a wonderful man.
Well, joining me today is Melanie Contreras, although at the time that the event occurred that we're going to be talking about today, her name was Melanie Brando, and she was married to Greg Brando, who used to be the head of IT, which meant that he had access to emails that happened back and forth in Daystar. And if you've been following this story, you know that that's relevant because Marcus Lamb, his affair that became known to some employees back in 2007, that became apparent because of emails. And so there's a lot of light that Melanie's going to be shedding on what actually happened and filling in some holes that we don't know about yet with what happened there. But she also was a co-host on Joni Lamb's Table Talk. And for about 15 years, she worked as a senior certified trainer at Life Languages. And that is the organization founded by Fred and Anna Kendall. And if you've been following this story too, you're probably aware of Anna Kendall. She's the one that was referred to by our podcaster friend Ray Curry as Redwig. But she's been a part of this story for a very long time as well. And Melanie has some real concerns about Fred and Anna Kendall and their Life Languages curriculum. So let me just welcome Melanie Contreras, again, formerly Melanie Brando. Just so glad that you can join us, Melanie.
Hi there. Glad to be with you today.
And Melanie, if I'm understanding correctly, you decided to do this because of something that you saw in one of the videos that we put out from the Restore conference, which was just this past February. Would you describe what it was that really impacted you and why you decided that you're going to go public with this story that's never been told before, correct?
I was watching the video of the Restore conference, and as I was watching the three ladies who were talking about their trauma and victimization from Mike Bickle, the words caught me so much. I'm going to try to say this without being emotional, but one of the ladies said to the other one that when she was watching her testimony about her abuse, that she felt the Lord telling her that she needed to tell her story. And her words were so important, the words that she used, because what she said to the other woman was, it was not just because you told the story, it was because you shared the details of the abuse. And she said that she could then recognize that they were so similar. Her story was so similar to the other lady's story. And she said that she knew then that that's how people get set free. And I felt so convicted. I felt, I've dealt with the trauma of my experience for so many years. And so it is a journey that is, overwhelming, but I just know in my heart that there's so many people going through similar trauma. And so when she said that, when I heard her words, I thought, oh my Lord, that's me. And I wouldn't want to be responsible for holding somebody's freedom from them.
And so your trauma is not just related to your experience at Daystar, although we'll get into that, what happened at Daystar, but also Fred and Anna and their life languages.
Yes, the Kendalls. I met them in 1999 and was very drawn to them. They taught on marriage, and I was in a very toxic marriage, a very toxic and abusive marriage. And so when I met them, I thought that they were going to have all the answers. They ministered frequently at the church that I was attending, and they would talk to us one-on-one after the classes that they taught and stuff like that. And it wasn't too long after I met them that Fred started recruiting me to be one of the trainers for their program, Life Languages. It was just really a few months before I was working with them, and the relationship with them was so mixed. At the beginning, it was just, so exciting, and they, had such praise for me, and they just, it really felt like I was loved and accepted. And that was something that, coming from my background, I really, yearned for. And there were little things at the beginning, but it really was later, after I was very involved, that things started turning sour, and I stuck with them. They were big on loyalty, and the church that I was going to was big on loyalty also. And they knew, they knew what words to say and how to keep people around. And I didn't have any, all of that kind of toxic behavior was very familiar to me. And so it didn't seem odd. It just seemed to me like that's life, and that, people are who they are, and you just have to take them as they are, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I certainly don't believe those things now. I didn't have any basis for comparison. Like, I didn't have anybody to go to. I didn't have anybody speaking into my life that would say, oh, wait, that's not okay, and people shouldn't talk to you that way, and no, that's not good counsel, or whatever. So there were a lot of things that they told me and my ex-husband about our marriage, and about the way that we should behave, and the way we should interact with each other, and what my responsibility was as a wife and a mother and a Christian. And it just turned out to be very controlling and manipulative, so that I would do what they said or do what my husband wanted me to do, instead of, what would have been safe.
And I know you're concerned, because when we talked about this a few days ago, if it happened to you, it could be happening to others. And so I know you're kind of wanting to sound that alarm. And so we're going to get into what happened with the Kendalls. But then before we do that, I want to talk about what I referenced a little bit earlier, and that is that in 2007, up until this point, everything I've read, of course, a lot of my information comes from the lawsuit that was filed by Jeanette Hawkins. I've read that, and I think everything in there is true from her perspective. But what you're telling me is there's a whole backstory that Jeanette was never privy to. That makes a lot of sense with why your husband would have been involved in all of this. The two people mentioned besides Jeanette are Terry Germany, who was another employee at Daystar. But again, according to the lawsuit, Terry Germany brought those emails to Jeanette. And so it sounds like she assumed that they came from, that he had discovered them, and then he resigned right away. But your husband was the head of IT. So start filling us in. What happened with this backstory? Because this was just a wow when you were telling me about it.
My ex-husband was the head of IT for Daystar Television for 7 years. And at that time, he wasn't hired as the director. He was hired as, one of the IT workers, and he, moved up the ladder. He hadn't been director very long when this happened, but one day he came home and he said, I need you to help me with this, and I don't know what to do about it. And I said, okay. And he handed me a stack of papers. And I mean, like, a stack of papers. It was a lot. And I said, what is this? And when he started to explain how he got it and what it was, I was shocked. And so what he explained to me was that this was a printout of years worth of correspondence on like intra-office devices between Marcus and Janice. I think it's Smith.
Janice Smith, she was the VP, vice president. Yeah, vice president right below Marcus at that time in 2007.
She was the right-hand man, so to speak. And she had been moved from another state into Texas to be closer, more accessible. You know, we already knew all of those things.
Mm-hmm. And she was at Colorado, which was one of the other main stations.
Yes.
One, I think, was the second station that Daystar added outside of Texas that then made it the network. But yeah,
I think that's correct. That's correct. And people mistake that Daystar is a station, but Daystar is a network. So it has many, applications. Anyway, so Greg told me that he had been asked to remove an email that was sent mistakenly. It was supposed to go to Janice, and it went to Joni instead. And being that they both had J names, it was a mistake.
By
Marcus. Marcus, yes.
So he mistakenly sent an email to his wife that was meant for his mistress.
Correct.
Big oops.
Yes. So Greg explained to me that because it was intra-office, that if an email hadn't been opened yet by the receiver, that he could pull it back. And this is what he was explaining to Marcus. And if it had already been opened, that he couldn't pull it back. So on this occasion, he was able to pull it back. And so, he thought, no harm, no foul, whatever. And then like a week or two passed by, whatever the time period was, and he got another call from Marcus saying, can you do it again? He had made the mistake again, so can you do it again? And when Greg went to look, he couldn't, because it had already been opened. And then there was already a response. And then they were in an argument about the inappropriateness of that email. And that email was basically harmless. It was just talking about that Janice looked really pretty that day. It didn't say anything, crazy. But being that another part of Greg's job was to monitor correspondence and computer use while you were on office time and also on office devices, he had access to everybody's devices. And so when he had these two, not just one, but two now, emails that were in question or whatever, he decided to look through more emails. And so what he found was a correspondence that was, years long, and it was between the two of them, and it gave very specific details of their relationship and what they were doing and what they planned to do and so forth.
So you read all these emails?
He printed them out and he brought them home, and we sat together and read through all of them. And I mean, there was an element that was just like shock and like, this is crazy and I can't believe this. But then there was also a part of me that was searching for some kind of redemption. Maybe it was a mistake, or we misunderstood, or maybe like, I didn't know what to think. And so, yes, I read everything that he printed out that day. I read through all of them, and he did as well.
Obviously, I don't want to hear all the salacious details, and that's not our purpose in this whole program. But there were some things that you mentioned to me that you read that are of note. One dealt with what was going to happen to Joni, the kind of promises he made, which, I mean, just kind of shocking to me, because coming right off of the Mike Bickle thing, which we've mentioned, which was, at the International House of Prayer, we know he told a lot of these women, oh, his wife's going to die and then he can marry them. Similar type thing?
Very similar, yes. That was the plan. That what he told her was essentially that Joni was in such poor health that she was going to die, and that they were going to marry, and that they were going to run Daystar together. And, that was just horrible, of course, to listen to, but then to think that was, whether he meant that or not, or I don't know what his intention was. Of course, we're not, we can't read anybody's mind, but for her to hear that and think that that was his intention, to be with her forever, and that would be the reason. And it was overwhelming. And then there were other parts where he described in great detail their sexual encounters and his plans for future sexual encounters, and described even one time a vacation that they were all on together, the two families with their children and their little, hideaway sexual romps, that while, the rest of the family was in another area on the same vacation.
So this one is of interest because I've received some photos, and it's from 2004 is what I'm told. It was a ski vacation, and this would have been when Janice was still in Colorado. And in these pictures are her husband and her children. And you're telling me that you read emails saying that on that vacation, while the kids are out on the slopes, the spouses are out on the slopes, Marcus and Janice are having sexual relations.
Yes.
Back in the...
Yeah.
Wow. And what's I think stunning about this is that I guess I've always, just from what I've heard so far, I've assumed that Janice was single because she was single when she was in Texas.
Yes, I thought she was single because when I met her, she was single.
But we're talking, this predates that. This is back when she was in Colorado, and this happened when she was still married. So that makes what happened with Marcus even worse, because he split up a family.
It's horrible to think about that. It's so disheartening. We all looked up to him so much and just thought that he was such a wonderful man. Both of them, that they had the greatest marriage, and, they were the greatest parents, and they had just this incredible ministry, and we all looked up to them.
So was that disillusioning for you personally?
Oh, of course. Of course it was. It was disillusioning. It was disheartening. It made you feel, and I didn't grow up in church. I gave my life to the Lord later, and it was really hard being the first one to know the Lord in my family. I was not accepted. That path was not accepted. I had a very hard time and really had to kind of not wait, but like I couldn't sort all that out until I was a young adult. And then when I really dedicated my life, couldn't be, because I thought, I can make my own decisions now, and I wasn't dependent on, parents or family to, agree with me. So I didn't have that lifetime of faith and lifetime of knowing the Lord and walking closely with him. My faith was, just developing, when I was a young adult. And so by the time my ex-husband and I got to Daystar, I really thought I had a handle on what I believed about God. But I think one of the big problems that people in their faith walk encounter is being able to separate how church leadership, they're human and they make mistakes and they do things that are wrong and they make poor choices. And that's not representative of God. That's representative of their humanity. And so at that time, I couldn't really separate that. And so when you look at a leader, a church leader, a ministry leader, you think that they have, a direct connection to God that you don't have, or that that they have some kind of, holiness that you don't have. And so you trust them and you depend on them. And, I think that's why, the Bible talks about leadership being above reproach, because that responsibility is so huge. And it's really tough when somebody, doesn't understand that people are people and they can make all kind of choices, and that's not what God probably would have intended.
Still so disappointing. And I think that is why, Scripture says those of you who teach will be held to a higher standard, and why there are qualifications for preachers and pastors and elders in the church. But let's go back to this situation. So you I can only imagine, here you are with literally, you're saying like a ream, like what, 300 to 500 pages?
I mean, I don't remember the page count. And of course, it's all like these texts. And so it's not just, all solid words, but it was a big stack of papers. And so there definitely was, more than a couple hundred pages there. It was just so much. And because the correspondence had been for years. And I think that the people who are talking about how long the affair was it 5 years? Was it 7 years? And I don't think that any of those they're speaking as if that were fact. I don't think any of those are accurate, because what I read was 7 or 8 years of stuff. And, that only it started in the middle of a conversation. It didn't start, it started when they got those new devices. And so there had to be this whole setup before that, because you don't just start talking like that.
So they got new devices. They got new devices 7 or 8 years prior to these being discovered. But prior to that,
I don't know if those, I don't know where the correspondence started on those devices, but I know that at the start of where he started printing, that was a new device that started that thread. And so I don't know what was before that. I don't know if devices came later. I don't know how long that was, but whatever was captured in that printout was 7 or 8 years, or they referred to 7 or 8 years.
So we know it was at least 7 or 8 years, but it could have been much longer, is what you're saying. You don't know.
Would think it would have to be, because you don't just start like that.
Yeah.
But there's no way that we won't know.
Sure. So what did you decide to do with them?
So that was the big question. The reason why he brought them home is because he didn't know what to do. And so my immediate response was like, my Lord, we have to tell this woman, meaning Joni, because I would never want someone to have information like that and not share it with me. I can't imagine being in that position and not knowing, and you have children and you would have all these life decisions to make, and not having all the information would be, I think very wrong. And so I said, we have to tell. And he said, no, I'll get fired. If he's capable of this, what else is he capable of? And so he said, there's no way. Well, there's no way we're going to tell. There's no way we're going to tell. And I said, well, I really, really think we can. And I think we have to. And so we kind of decided together, okay, well, let's go to our mentors. Let's go to our spiritual leadership and see what kind of counsel they will give us. And that's how we ended up at the Kendalls.
Yeah. So then you go to Fred and Anna Kendall's house.
No, I went to Fred, to the office.
Just to Fred. Okay. So you go to the office and he sees these, and what does he say?
Well, he looked through a few of them, and he immediately told Greg, I want you to make me 3 printed copies, 3 CD copies, and 3 thumb drive copies. And he said, we're going to put them in the safe. And he said, because people like that need to be held to accountability, and just in case we ever have to write the book, kind of with a wink and a little chuckle. And
write the book.
Yeah. So whatever that meant. And what I interpreted that to mean was that he was going to have something to hold over them in case they didn't do what he wanted. But again, that's speculation. I don't know what was in his head. And in the course of that meeting, we talked about, Greg's fear of being fired, or, some kind of retaliation. And I talked about, how I just really felt like we needed to tell, because it was so hurtful and she might make other decisions. And I had no idea. I hadn't met them beyond, like an office party that we went to or something like that. Like, I didn't know them personally, like friendship or anything at that point. And so I didn't know what he was doing or what she was doing or what they would think or what would be the, their reaction or anything. I thought without that information, she can't make the decisions that she might want to make. The conclusion that we all came to and what Fred counseled us to do was that instead of going to Marcus, we were going to go to Joni, and that the three of us were going to go together. And Greg said, I'm not bringing you into this at this point. They don't know you. That would be weird. Melanie and I will go. We will go to her.
So at this point, everybody knows Fred and Anna, Kendall is very much a part of the Daystar ministry. But at that point, not at that point. In fact, you said they didn't even like the Lambs or Daystar.
No, not really. They didn't have very nice things to say about them or the show. No, they weren't like household names or, and there was not any kind of contract or involvement on that level at that point with the Kendalls.
Okay. So the two of you and Greg that's the plan. You're going to go to Joni.
Yes. So the plan was that Greg and I would go to Joni. Fred wanted to go, but Greg didn't want Fred to be there. So it was just going to be he and I, and we were going to go to Joni. And somewhere in there, after we had made that plan and we went home and a day had passed or a couple of days or whatever, we were waiting for the right time, to go to Joni. And I think at that time, Marcus was out of town. And so, or was going to go out of town. So Greg was kind of waiting for the right moment to approach her. And one day he came home and told me that he had shown Jeanette Hawkins, who was the director of marketing, all of the printout. And I said, why did you do that? And he said he didn't really have an excuse. He just said he felt like she should know. And come to find out, then also he told Terry Germany. And so I didn't know about Terry yet, but I knew about Jeanette. And I said, well, what does she think? And what's going to happen now? And how does that expose you? And is she going to tell anybody? Because I didn't know her. And he said, I think we need to bring her into the loop. And so we ended up asking her to go with us to meet Fred at the office. So we all met over there and talked, and Fred kind of coached Jeanette. And what I hated was exposing her to him, because even from that very first meeting, he was so manipulative with her. And I could see a physical reaction. Like I could see it, anxiety, kind of welling up. And it was already so emotionally charged to be talking about what we were talking about, and for everybody to be afraid of what was going to happen with their jobs and even the ministry, because that was a huge ministry we all believed in. And so we didn't know what was going to happen with the ministry if this was, to surface or whatever. We didn't know. And so we still planned that it was going to be Greg and I that talked to Joni. But in the next few days, Greg came home one day from work and said that he took all of the printouts to Bill Trammell, who was Joni's father. And I said, why did you do that? That wasn't what we had planned. That's not what Fred, and you and I had talked about, or even Jeanette. And he said that he felt much safer going to Bill because that was her father. And he felt like he would be so much more protected by going to him. And so that's just what he decided to do. And there was just no arguing. It was already done. There wasn't anything we could do about it. And I found out much later that Greg and Terry went to Jeanette and told her all about, showed her the printouts, and Terry had already read the printouts. And Terry very quickly resigned and left. And Jeanette stayed to, I guess, I don't want to speak for her, but see what was going to happen. I don't know. And I don't remember Jeanette meeting with Fred very much. I don't know if it was more than that one time or maybe two times, but it was kind of like once Greg took the papers to Bill, it was, that all of our parts were finished.
So you're saying that the part about your husband bringing in Terry and Jeanette, you didn't find out that until quite a bit later?
After the fact. I mean, it was all within a few days, but he didn't tell me, hey, I'm going to go do this. He didn't tell Fred, hey, I'm going to go do this. He just did it. And so then after the fact, then he would tell me that it happened. And, Fred and I talked on a daily basis. And so, I would tell him what happened and he would tell Anna, or we were all talking about it.
And so that meeting with Fred and Jeanette and Greg, were you in that meeting too?
Yes, I was there.
You were there?
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously by that point you knew that she was in.
Yes.
And Terry was.
Yes.
In that meeting, did Fred seem inclined to say Marcus needed to resign?
No, he didn't talk much about what needed to happen to him. We were really concentrated on giving Joni the information. He was in agreement with that, and protecting Greg's job. And then to protect Jeanette's job, because why was she involved at all? That was Greg's, decision. Pulled her into it, where she probably didn't need to be, burdened with any of that ever. She didn't need to.
At this point, you didn't know Joni, but later, after this all happened, you two became quite close, and she explained some of these things. Well, what did Joni tell you happened after Bill got, again, her father, got these emails?
Bill took the stack of papers to Joni, and she read through them, and she said she read through every word, front to back. She read all of it, like in one sitting. And Marcus was coming back into town that night, and so that's when she was going to confront him, and that's what she did. And she confronted him with that printout.
And what was his response, according to Joni?
According to Joni, she said, and this is hard to talk about, Julie, because these were the words shared by, it was my understanding there that we were, friends. And so it's really tough to look back and think that maybe that's not the way they thought of me. Maybe not at all, or maybe not ever. I don't know. But it's hard to, I would have never told any of these stories. I would have never said anything except what all is going on right now, that so many people are being hurt and so many people are being pulled into this drama. My heart is not to hurt people. My heart is that people would find their freedom, through Jesus. And anyway, so to answer the question, she told me that Marcus was very repentant and full of humility, and basically just begged her to stay with him, and that he loved her, and that he loved the kids, and he wanted to stay a family, and he didn't want them to separate him. And what could he do to, gain her love and trust, back after this, breach. And so, and the way she told the story was heart-wrenching. And, I don't know how anybody could not have compassion for somebody who was seemingly so sincere. And there was a part of Marcus that was like that in the years following that I came to know Marcus and Joni better, and thought that we were friends, and that I thought that, everybody loved each other. I really saw some things in Marcus that I thought were sincere, and he, really did love her and loved the kids and loved the Lord, and just had made some really poor decisions. But, again, we don't know what's in people's minds. And so when you make decisions like that over and over, it's hard to dismiss.
And you said the power dynamic before this happened, Marcus was really in control. Like, he was the one who built Daystar. I mean, yes, Marcus and Joni co-founded Daystar, and that's kind of always been the narrative. But you said, from your perspective, of course, you weren't on staff, but you later had a very close look at what happened. You felt like things, and from your perspective, there was a shift.
I think the shift started after they started being counseled by Fred. I think it was a directive. I think that was part of Fred's instructions. And so, whereas you would see before when they would interact, or it seemed to me, and others, might agree, that it was like Marcus was running, the business, and running the station, and running the network, and making all those big decisions. And Joni was there, and I'm sure that they worked together on a lot of things. But Joni was mostly working on her show, and as far as the organization at large, those were the decisions that, Marcus was making. And that's what it seemed like to all of us. Of course, I don't know what happened behind closed doors, but that's what it seemed like. And he looked very, friendly and all of that in their interactions. But there was a big shift later after, I think it was after the instructions, but where he was so lovey-dovey with her, and just so, kind of like just oozing, affection, and on the air and off the air. Like, they were just always, and you would see her just kind of pull back or kind of give a look, like whatever. And sometimes she would put her hand on his arm, like, that's enough. And that was something also that the Kendalls would teach in their marriage and classes and stuff like that, that spouses should have signals and scripts to stick to with each other so that they can be better communicators. And one of them was, putting your hand lightly on the other person. And if they didn't respond, maybe give a little squeeze. And so, that all looked very familiar to me after they started talking with the Kendalls. I take the responsibility, and I feel very regretful, but I was the one who sent Marcus and Joni to the Kendalls. And
yeah, talk about how that came to be. This was like, so she got, from my understanding, she got the emails on a Friday. On a Saturday, you guys were out like garage sailing or something, and
my ex-husband and I were out looking at garage sales, and just spending a Saturday out. And he gets a call from Marcus to come to the house immediately. And one of the things, that everybody knew there, as I would say most people, especially higher up in the organization, you knew that if Marcus called, that you had to answer immediately, and you had to go do whatever they were talking about immediately. Like, everybody was on call all the time. And so he told me, I have to take you home because I have to go over to their house. And basically he was being told to wipe all the ability to correspond with Janice from his computer and his devices, to wipe all that stuff off, to take any software off, any conversations, anything that would link the two of them, and shut down the her personal devices and all that kind of stuff. And so he was going to have to go to the house to do that, because that's where his PC was, and he had his laptop there and all this kind of stuff, his phone and whatever. And so I tell the story, and I told you the story, and this is just how it happened. And I don't, I know that some people are not going to, people are going to have their opinions, but this is really what happened. We're in the car, and we're headed home now because he has to drop me off so that he can go to their house. And he was, my ex-husband, he was just so nervous, and, I understand why. And he was just so full of anxiety, and just talking about how bad it was going to be. And he just was so convinced. He didn't know that he was going to go there and do all this stuff with the devices necessarily, that was the only reason he was going. But he really thought that he was going to get fired. He thought that's why they were calling him over there, was that he was going to get fired. And so everything that, coming out of his mouth was just, fearful and negativity and all this kind of stuff, because he was so afraid. And I said, let's just pray. And so we started praying, I started praying. And, I'm just trying to, bring peace and whatever. And I just stopped, and I closed my eyes, and I saw, in my mind's eye, I saw a vision with me delivering a message to Marcus. And when I opened my eyes, I told Greg, I said, I have to go with you. I have to deliver this message. I really feel like this is what God has wanted me to do. I have to go deliver this message. And he said, there's no way I'm taking you with me. No, we're not doing that. You're going to get me fired. They're already going to fire me. And if they weren't, then now they will, and you can't go. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. I just really believe that this is what God wants me to do. And so we had to go home and change our clothes because, we were out in the sun that day, and now we wanted to be presentable to go to their house. And we went, so it took us a little while. When we finally got over there, we pulled up in the driveway, and, and I'm just praying, and we get out of the car. And the way Joni tells the story, she says that when she saw us drive up and I got out of the car, she was like, why did you bring your wife? And it was really inappropriate, so I can understand why she would have that reaction. And so we got out of the car and we walked in, and we were walking where Marcus's office was, is a couple steps down. And so we were walking, in that doorway and walking down the steps. Greg was ahead of me. Joni greeted him. Greg was ahead of me. Greg walked down the steps, and he was kind of moving. Marcus came out from around his desk, and they were like trading places so that Greg could be behind the desk. And Marcus looked up, and he, looked in my eyes. He caught eyes with me, and he came up to me, and it was one of the most sincere things I've ever seen any human do. And he got down on his knees, and he put his hands in mine, and through tears, he said, is there any hope for us? Can you help us? I mean, it chokes me up thinking about it right now, because I could tell he was in so much pain. And I looked at Joni, and I looked at him, and I didn't know what to do. And, I'd never been put in that position before. And I remembered what I felt like the Lord wanted me to say to him. And at that moment, it was so, like, it made so much sense after what he had just said. And I said, rise, you mighty man of valor. And I said, absolutely, the Lord has a plan for you. Absolutely, the Lord has hope for you. You have to choose that plan. You have to choose God. And that's the way out. And we talked for a second, and of course he stood up, and we all talked, and they told Greg, they instructed him what he wanted him to do. And Greg was working while we were talking. And in the course of that conversation, what they were asking me was, can you counsel us? And I said, I am not a licensed therapist. I'm not a counselor. I'm a coach. I'm a communication coach. And so I don't feel comfortable with that. And she said that they had already talked to some other counselors, and they were not in agreement or whatever, and they were having a hard time figuring out what they were going to do next. And do they stay in the ministry? Do they leave the ministry? Do they, what do they do? And there were so many questions, and I really felt like this is just out of my scope. And I had been part of other ministries where we knew very well the line that you don't cross into therapy if you're not a licensed therapist. And so you have to refer out to someone who has greater training and education than you. And so I, foolishly, because I trusted them, so much, I regret, I told them, y'all should go see Fred and Anna Kendall. Y'all should go see Fred Kendall. Anna didn't counsel, Fred did. And so I said, you need to go see him. And that's how they ended up over there.
So you sent them to Fred and Anna Kendall, but they're not licensed counselors either. And this is something, I prior to covering this Daystar story, I confess I've never heard of Fred and Anna Kendall or the life languages. But since I've been covering this story, I realized this thing is really quite large, and that they're counseling people. And this was who Marcus and Joni went for marriage counseling, and they're not licensed marriage counselors, and that's kind of a big deal. Like, that is a classification that is, I mean, for example, Doug Weiss, Joni's current husband, got censured by, the Colorado state, body there that oversees counselors, because he claimed to be a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he wasn't. And I'm not saying that Fred and Anna Kendall have done that, yet it does seem like they did an awful lot of this counseling. And we'll get into more of that later, but I do want to just kind of finish this part of the story. So during this whole time, you actually then become, so they go to the Kendalls for counseling, and you become the suicide watch for Janice. Is that right? Like, you went over there and spent time with her?
Yes, I was asked to go to her house in the evening, and the week that she was going to leave town, after everything was exposed, and I guess there was some kind of talk between somebody to let her know what was going on. I don't know if it was Marcus or Joni, but anyway, she knew what was going to happen and what they were telling her had to happen as far as her job. And so I was asked, Joni asked me to go to her house in the evening and spend time with her and make sure that she wasn't suicidal, because they thought that they had a suspicion that she might be suicidal. And so,
was she, from your, what you saw?
From my perspective, she was not suicidal, but I'm not a professional. And so I just did what I was told. I stayed with her for several hours and I let her talk. And she talked a lot and told me, what her perspective was and how she felt, and what she felt like was happening to her was so unfair. And I just tried to listen, because I didn't think that my opinion was good enough, or that my opinion was valid, or that people would approve, like Marcus, Joni, Fred, Anna would approve of what I really thought. And so I just kept that to myself.
So, but this is one of the big questions, because Marcus, he is in a position of spiritual authority. He's also a position as her employer, her boss. So there's a huge power differential between Marcus Lamb and Janice Smith. And we don't know if there was grooming involved, how this relationship happened. But I'll just say this, from my understanding of adult clergy sexual abuse, this is how it often happens. And so we think, that this is a person who is a full-fledged adult. She should know better. That's kind of the standard way of thinking. And yet now we're understanding a little bit more that, oh, no, there's this huge power differential. And there is a predatory kind of behavior. And again, I'm not privy to what happened or what went on, but I'm just curious, because this is such a question. I mean, do you feel like she was a victim?
I absolutely feel like she was a victim. And I know that people have painted her as this seductress and she ruined their marriage. And, anybody can say that. And I'm not even saying that that's not true. I don't know what the dynamic was between them before I was ever involved. But I will say this, you cannot ignore the fact, not the assumption, the fact that he was her boss, that both of them were her boss, that he was, a minister, that this was a huge ministry that they were a part of, where she answered to him directly. And so, and also there's a few years between now and when this happened. And so now we are so much more aware of where the line is drawn, that I think that if this were happening today, it have played out very differently, because, or I would hope, but isn't that why we're doing the show, is so that people will know that's not okay. It is not okay. And people just can't do that and hide behind touch not thine anointed. Like, that's not what that's for. That's not what that means.
Yeah. Well, and he got to keep his position. He got to keep his job. He got to keep his family. She gave up. She lost her family. She lost her job. She lost everything at that point.
Yeah. And made her, like she didn't have any, I feel like she didn't have as many choices because of the situation that she was in with him being her boss, but made her part of the inappropriate financial decisions that were being made because and around her. So, when they sent her out of town, they gave her a large amount of money, and they, paid for her house because she had just bought a new house, and all of those things that maybe she wouldn't have chosen in a professional, situation. I feel like she was she had to be a part of that, a part of those decisions. And, that I felt like that's not what she would have chosen. she felt like that was out of her control.
I mean, do you know what account paid for her house? What account gave her that? You don't know.
No. I know that that's what happened from her and from Joni telling me what was going to happen, and then that it did happen afterwards. And then, of course, her story, as I listened to her while I was with her at her house, I heard the same thing. I have to be out by this time. I can never speak to him again. I have to turn in on my device. Like, she told me all the things that they were, basically forcing her to do so that she would never talk about it again, and she would leave quickly and never have anything to do with that again. And I cannot imagine. I remember listening to Jeanette talk about having to try to find a job after, everything blew up. And I had a similar experience where I was blacklisted also. And so I cannot imagine Janice trying to get a job after that. Like, how do you explain anything? How do you, you can't, especially if you've signed anything that says you can't talk legally.
And she did sign an NDA.
That's correct. What I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
She said so much and they said so much. So.
Wow. So at this point, Janice leaves. I mean, there's a very small group of people that know what happened. This is 2007. Again, the lawsuits and everything didn't happen until 2010. So there's these 3 years. And during those 3 years, a lot happens with you. All of a sudden, you start being pulled into Joni's Table Talk program. You're very much become part of her inner circle, as do Fred and Anna. And I want to talk a lot about that, but I also want to kind of back up at this point and get the context, because Fred and Anna were a huge part of your life, and their life languages, that whole entire course, all of that was a big part of your life.
They called me their daughter.
They called you your yikes.
Publicly, they would introduce me as their spiritual daughter or their surrogate daughter or their adopted daughter, and that that we were so close, and that our relationship was eternal, and that I had a huge life language inheritance coming. And they would say all kinds of things that would indicate how close we were.
Wow. But of course, and at least from my ears, that's the kind of language. And you talked about this too, the love bombing, which is very common. I hate to say it, but a lot of abusive relationships. And if you really want, and the spiritual daughter, spiritual father stuff, I mean, this is kind of grooming behavior to gain control over someone.
Yes, and it goes from that to, and you can never do anything without us. So you could never have a job without us. You could never be in ministry without us. You could never do any of this without us. We've built you. And wow. Wow,
that is really powerful. So the Life Languages program, you became a senior trainer. And so you were really immersed in this program. For those who are listening, aren't familiar with it at all, what is the Life Languages program?
So Life Languages is a questionnaire that then goes through a formula to produce an assessment of your communication styles. And it was all based on Romans 12. So there's 7 in Romans 12, there's 7 motivational gifts. They're gifts from God the Father. It says that in the scripture. And so there in the New Testament, there's more than 3, but there's 3 main sets of giftings. One is the fivefold ministry from Jesus in Ephesians, and one is the gifts of the Holy Spirit in Corinthians. And so this is in Romans, and it's commonly referred to as the motivational gifts. And what it indicates in the scripture is this is how we make this is where we make our decisions from, and our behavior and all that comes out of these different modalities. And so what the Kendalls did was develop a program that was a survey and produces a profile of how people communicate. And it's a printout. It's like over 100 questions. And then there's a printout that's several pages long. And you find out in kind of a descending order which of those gifts you use primarily, and then the ones that are, used less.
And this is huge now. I mean, I went on their website. 300,000 people have taken this assessment. It's in 185 countries. Some of the corporate organizations that are familiar with it and that have used it, include Daystar, obviously, which prior to this happening, again, the Kendalls were not part of it. Yeah, not at all. But here they get Daystar as a client, which all those employees then are taken.
Yeah, Daystar was my client, but they took it away from me.
Oh, they had been your client.
Well, I was the one who brought them to the Kendalls, and I was the one who brought life languages to them. Before this all happened with the affair and all that, Greg and I were both asked by Fred Kendall, will you please gain Daystar as a client? But Greg felt like that was a conflict of interest to try to push that on his employer. And so we didn't do it up to that point. But then when I started talking with mostly Joni, occasionally Marcus, about the situation that they were in and trying to come out of, I would refer to the life languages a lot because that's what I, kind of lived by. And so they asked about it, and, I had them profiled and their kids profiled and all this kind of stuff. And it grew from there. And so if you think about the technicality of it, they were my client. And then the first time that I was on Table Talk, which was the first Table Talk, it changed format from, or the model of the show was changed from the Joni show to Joni Table Talk. And I was on that first one. And she talked about the life languages. And when you refer to something on a show like that, people, they want to be a part of it also. And so when the profiles started coming in, and the money from all of that, and the possibility, of doing more, the Kendalls weren't on the show yet. We weren't running organizational profiles. We weren't running viewer profiles up to that point. But when I was on that show, it kind of changed things on that first show. And so Fred took me aside one day. I look back at this and think, how could I have been so stupid? But I just bought into everything they said until I didn't. But, and that unfortunately is the way it goes a lot of times. But he took me aside and he said, this client is too big for any one person. So this is not your client. This is going to be a house client. So you can work and you can do workshops, but all the profiles coming in, it's too many. And so this has to be a house client.
And what does house client mean in monetary terms?
That the house, like the office, like Fred and Anna, get all the money, and they don't give me a commission.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you brought this client essentially, but
thousands and thousands of profiles, and I've never gotten paid on anything. I got paid a day fee, I think one time or two times. I think it was one workshop or maybe two for the fee for going and speaking and presenting.
And how much would you get paid to do a workshop or speaking?
It's really embarrassing to say because other people who are professional public speakers know how much you should be getting, and I should have known better, but I didn't. And so I got paid anywhere from $50 to $100, $175 per event, not even per day, per event. And so that might be a 2-hour workshop, or that might be 4 10-hour days. It just would vary. So it just depended.
Wow.
Yeah.
So with their questionnaires, how much money would they make on a questionnaire?
Back then, I don't know what they're running right now, but back then I think they were $45. And so their philosophy was they wanted to be able to, for a family to be able to pay the same to profile the whole family as going out to eat. And so that was, what their pricing was.
So $45, but if you're in a, company like Daystar with how many employees? 240?
Two or 300, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that adds up pretty quickly, and they're just giving out tests.
Well, and they're not doing it because it's an algorithm. So it gets submitted to, a system, and the system spits it out. And so, they don't really have any involvement in that at all, except to look at the printout.
So here's the interesting thing to me. So Fred Kendall has zero education, indicating that he should be developing a psychological test or communication test. I looked at his education. He got an associate's degree from the New Mexico Military Institute. That was in military and strategic leadership. He got a BA in psychology from the University of New Mexico.
I don't know that he got the degree or if he just started it.
Well, he said that he got a BA in psychology. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt there that he got this from the University of New Mexico. I mean, that's a bachelor's degree. I mean, that's really, that doesn't, really qualify you to be an expert in something. And then he went for 1 year to the Hastings College of Law in California. That is the full extent of his education. Now, on his LinkedIn, it says 1989 to 1992, he was the president and co-founder of Life Care Therapy Centers. So this is, something he oversaw, but he wasn't doing the therapy. I mean, these were qualified people who were doing the therapy. And he wrote on his profile, it says, each program was a dual diagnosis program treating emotional and mental problems and addictions. Thousands of people from all areas of the U.S. were enrolled in the programs, were helped, healed, and restored. During this time and experience, the concepts of the 7 life languages were developed, tested, and administered. He was managing basically a therapy center, and he develops these 7 life languages. He says they were tested and administered. Do you know anything about the testing or the validation of this program?
I wasn't involved with that organization. The way that he told the story was that that's where he did, kind of like the preliminary and the experimentation and seeing how it would work. And he used those people, the patients, to try everything out on. I've never seen any data collected.
I just wanted to say, I reached out to Life Languages and to, asking to talk to Anna Kendall. My understanding is Fred has advanced Alzheimer's right now.
That's what I've heard.
From your understanding.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. So I reached out and said I would like to talk to them, hear their side of the story. I have not heard back from them. If before we publish this, they get back to me, I will add that to this podcast. But as of now, they have not gotten back to me at all. So, but again, I'm just looking at what I'm seeing here. And then Anna's education, she was a publicist and executive assistant for Mary Kay Ash of Mary Kay Cosmetics, which fantastic. I mean, she's probably extraordinarily gifted as an administrator. And then she hosted a bunch of talk shows, and she was the media or the marketing director for Life Care Therapy Centers where Fred worked. But that does not qualify somebody to be a marriage counselor or to counsel or to, even these life languages. I guess I'm wondering what the qualification is here. Is there any expert at any level that has verified this program that was developed by somebody with no licensure or anything?
There's no licensure, and to my knowledge, I'm not an attorney, but to my knowledge, what is required or what is kind of like the industry norm is that when you have a questionnaire that's survey style, there's this not self-assessed, but like, in other words, you're answering your own questions. Nobody's answering it for you. What I have been told and what I understand is that you then send your questionnaire and your data to a third-party organization that then validates that works. So it's not that your data, because the data is observational. And so if the person says, I like green, then, well, they like green, and you just leave it at that. But when you have a question that then produces a profile, that has to in some way give you the answers that you are trying to get. So your questions have to be asked in a certain way so that it is possible for it to produce those answers. And the Kendalls have never been able to validate theirs. What I've been told, their attorney would come in quite often into the classes when I first started being a trainer there, and he would explain a lot of things to me and to all of us, that we were in training. And so the process of being validated is so that your questionnaire can possibly produce and would consistently produce the kind of answers that you need to create the profile and then be able to work off of that profile. So the life languages have never been validated to the best of my knowledge. Now, I left and they're still going on. So if they have achieved that or if they've gotten that since I've been gone, I don't know about it. I've not heard anyone say that is true, but at the point that I left, it had never been done. And so when there were people coming who wanted to, like, say, purchase life languages, that was one of the questions that they would have. Has this been validated? No. The truth is no. And there were a lot of problems in the coding, the algorithms, but then also one of the biggest problems was that Fred would rewrite the questions constantly. And so then even your profile from now until, a month from now or whatever might be different. And they always said it was, because of his profile that he would behave and make those choices. And so everything was an excuse in their favor. And then other people, it would be, that's how, you're making mistakes and you shouldn't behave that way. And so it was very confusing. And the way that they would not just train people, because I felt like I was trained one way, but then the way that we worked was a different way. It was just highly manipulative in the way that they used the profiles. It was supposed to be for people's healing and freedom. And I found that in many, many cases, it was to control and manipulate.
How so?
I'll use my marriage for an example. The way that my ex-husband scores on his profile and the way that I score on my profile, my first language is his last language. And so then they would take that information, which, we found in the data from the profiles that was very common. Opposites attract, people marry their opposites, whatever. But what they would tell us as a married couple when they were counseling us is they would put the responsibility of communication and success on my shoulders instead of his, because he was this profile and I was that profile, and that was his last language and it's my first language, so I'm responsible. Well, how's that possible? How can I be responsible for his behavior? How can I be responsible for his decisions? If you go to a marriage and family therapist, if they're a good one, they're going to have the two people take responsibility for their own behavior. And, and you're responsible for, your choices. And so it was really confusing to be told not to use the profiles in that manner, but then that's the counsel that we were receiving. And that's the counsel that I watched him give many, many people. There were times so the Kendalls, the Life Languages, is a for-profit organization, and then they have a nonprofit organization called Family Restoration Network. So one of them is a ministry, and you can say Jesus, and the other one has to be EEOC compliant. So when we would go into corporate situations, like I trained lawyers' offices, doctors' offices, dentists, law enforcement, city organizations, like there was a lot of corporate that we did. And we would go in and get the employees' profiles, and then we would have meetings with HR to tell them how to handle the employees. Sometimes whether they kept their job or not. Sometimes whether they got hired or not. Sometimes their pay raises. Like there was so much that Fred could tell from a profile and how people would interact. But the way he used it, I felt like wasn't okay. And so then that continued in churches, and that continued in marriages, and that continued with parents and children. And, every kind of like people group that we were with, it was that kind of thing. And so unfortunately, when they got involved with Daystar and we were profiling all the employees of Daystar pretty much, part of his agreement was to have conference time with Joni and Marcus and tell them about the employees and their profiles and what was going on in their counseling sessions.
Wow. And this is such an abuse of counseling, because anybody knows that if you're a licensed counselor, you share anything that happens in that therapy session with your client, you're done. Like that, you lose your license. You may not do that. And I'm guessing that a lot of people have no clue. No clue. They're assuming confidentiality because that's the industry standard. They're probably, I'm guessing, assuming that Fred and Anna are licensed, just because they talk about counseling people, you just probably assume they must be licensed.
Yes. When they present themselves as marriage and family counselors, why would you question that? It's not, like just the common thing to say, but are you really? Like nobody does that. You just assume, and especially if it's coming from your bosses. This is another conflict of interest, is if your boss tells you you're going to take this profile, you're going to take this assessment, and I'm going to have your profile. There was always it was always controversial. It was always kind of decision to be made between the organization and Life Languages, whether those were going to be under lock and key or whether they were going to be made public to everyone. So different organizations would decide different things. And so what Fred tried to do and instruct us to do, and I did it too, was that at the beginning of training a new organization, we would print out everybody's profiles, and in your packet, you would have a copy of yours and everyone's. And that way there would be no privacy issue.
Well, this concludes part 1 of my interview with Melanie Contreras. But in part 2, she'll reveal even more concerning details about the Kendalls, not just about their Life Languages program, but about Fred's over-the-top control of Anna.
And then the waiter looked at the Kendalls, and Anna started saying what she wanted. And Fred put his hand on her wrist and squeezed lightly, and she stopped talking. And she looked down, and he ordered for them, but he only ordered one entree. And then the waiter left. And I'm just watching this, like, what is happening? And the waiter left, and he said in front of us, "Now, Anna, you don't need that. We will be sharing one dinner, and that'll be quite enough."
This is just one of several stories you'll hear in our next episode. You'll also hear about how Melanie became part of Joni's inner circle, but how that all came to a crashing end. So be watching for that release soon. Also, just a quick reminder that the Roy's Report is listener supported. So if you appreciate our work, please help us out with a gift this month. To do so, just go to julieroys, spelled ROYS.com/donate. That's julieroys.com/donate. Also, please subscribe to The Roy's Report on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. That way, you'll never miss an episode, and while you're at it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word about the podcast by leaving a review. And then, please share the podcast on social media so more people can hear about this great content. Again, thanks so much for joining me today, and God bless.